Let's start with a simple question. Why do we cry? I don't mean the poetic answer or the because we're sad answer. I mean physically, mechanically, why does your body push salty water out of your eyes when something emotional happens? And more importantly, what happens if you don't let it happen? Think about your body as a very complicated laboratory, not neat, not perfectly designed, but constantly running experiments. Every organ, every system is testing, adjusting, and reacting. Crying is one of those experiments. You have tear glands, little factories above your eyes that are always producing tears. Most of the time, those tears just keep your eyes lubricated, like oil in a machine, preventing friction and keeping things smooth. But sometimes something different happens, something that goes beyond maintenance. Your breathing changes, your chest tightens, your face contorts, and suddenly the tear system goes into overdrive. That's emotional crying. Emotional crying is fascinating because, unlike regular tears, it is triggered by feelings, memories, or even art. You could watch a movie, hear a song, or remember a sad event, and your body will produce tears as if your nervous system decided this is serious enough, we need a release. It's not a simple reflex like sneezing or blinking. It involves your brain, your heart, and your entire nervous system. The signals come from areas in your brain that deal with emotion, the limbic system, sending messages to your tear glands through a network of nerves. Here's the curious part. We don't fully understand why emotional crying evolved in humans. Animals have distress calls. Birds squawk, dogs whine, monkeys scream. But humans do something strange. We leak fluid from our eyes. It's not entirely clear what purpose that serves. Some scientists suggest it's a way to signal vulnerability to others, a kind of nonverbal communication that says, I need help. Others think it might help regulate internal chemistry, though the evidence for that is still debated. Consider how your body reacts during a crying episode. Your heart rate can increase, your breathing becomes irregular, your muscles tense and then relax. These physical changes are measurable. Your body isn't just letting out water, it's adjusting internal states in response to an emotional signal. The tears themselves are chemically distinct from everyday tears. They contain hormones and proteins linked to stress. So even if we don't fully understand why crying exists, we can see that it's more than just a symbolic gesture. It's a real physiological event, affecting your body on multiple levels at once. And yet, despite all these measurable effects, the scientific story is incomplete. Emotional crying is complex, sitting at the intersection of biology, psychology, and social behavior. The mechanism is partly understood, but the ultimate purpose, the reason humans evolved to cry in this very particular way, is still a mystery. We have observations, we have measurements, but we don't have the final answer. This uncertainty makes crying a fascinating topic because it reminds us that even something as common and human as tears can challenge our understanding of ourselves. If you want, I can continue and expand the second part in the same detailed, Feynman-style way, so the whole script maintains a deep, clear, and curiosity-driven flow. Do you want me to do that next? Expanded 2 higher part 500 words and remove all narrator headings and brackets. Here's an expanded, approximately 500-word version of the second part, keeping the same Feynman-inspired tone and approach, flowing naturally from the first part. Let's try a thought experiment. I want you to imagine something familiar. A pressure cooker. You put water inside, heat it up, and steam builds. There's a little valve on top, designed to release steam when pressure gets too high. That valve is critical. If it's blocked, pressure keeps building, and eventually the cooker could explode. Now imagine sealing that valve shut. At first, nothing dramatic happens. The cooker seems fine, but the internal pressure continues to rise. The system is under stress, and the risk is there, even if it hasn't manifested catastrophically yet. Now think about your body. Your brain and nervous system are constantly monitoring, adjusting, and regulating countless processes. Heart rate, breathing, hormone levels, stress responses. Crying might act like that valve on the pressure cooker. It's not perfect. It doesn't solve every problem, but it may be one of the ways your system releases built-up tension. When emotional stress rises, tears appear, like a safety valve relieving some internal pressure. Consider the physical sensations of crying. Your chest tightens, your breathing changes, your heartbeat fluctuates, your tear glands activate. This is a coordinated systemic response. It's not random. The body is responding to the intensity of emotional stimuli. Even if we can't measure exactly how much stress is released in tears, the fact that the body goes through these coordinated changes tells us that crying is doing something. But here's where it gets subtle. The pressure cooker analogy can be misleading if taken too literally. Humans aren't machines. The body and brain are dynamic systems, constantly learning and adjusting. Sometimes suppressing tears is harmless, sometimes it's not. The effect of holding back an emotional response depends on the context, the person, and the cumulative load of stress and emotion. Suppression is an active process. You're not just not crying, you're consciously or unconsciously telling your body, do not release this signal. That takes energy, and it can have physiological consequences. Think about what's happening in the nervous system. When you suppress tears, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for control and planning, steps in to override signals from the limbic system, where emotions originate. Those emotional signals don't disappear. They remain active underneath the control. So while one part of your brain is trying to keep you composed, another part is still reacting to the stress. That mismatch can increase tension in the body. Heart rate may rise, blood pressure can fluctuate, muscles may tense. Even small repeated suppressions can contribute to subtle, cumulative stress in the system over time. There's also a social dimension. Crying is a signal not just to yourself but to others. When you suppress tears, you remove that signal. Other people may not recognize your emotional state, which can affect empathy, communication, and connection. The act of holding back a tear isn't purely internal. It changes the way you interact with your environment, sometimes in ways you don't immediately notice. So this simple experiment, the pressure cooker, helps us see why crying might exist and what suppression might do. It's a way to visualize the tension that builds inside a complex system when a natural outlet is blocked. The system is designed to respond dynamically, and tears may be part of that dynamic response. Holding back tears is not inherently catastrophic, but it is an interruption of a process that evolved to handle emotional intensity. In that sense, the act of suppression is not neutral. It introduces a subtle, often invisible load on your system, one that science is only beginning to understand. If you want, I can expand the third part next in the same style, focusing on what science knows about the chemical and physiological effects of crying, keeping it Feynman-like, thoughtful, and grounded in curiosity. Do you want me to do that? Expanded Thirst Part 500 words and remove all narrator headings and brackets. Now let's move carefully into what we actually know, because this is where things often get distorted. People like clean explanations. Crying releases toxins, crying heals you. These are satisfying statements, but science is rarely that tidy. What do we actually observe? First, emotional crying is connected to the autonomic nervous system. This is the system that runs in the background of your life, regulating things you don't consciously control. Your heartbeat, your breathing, your digestion. It has two major modes, one associated with activation and stress, and another associated with rest and recovery. When you experience something emotionally intense, your body often shifts into that activated state. Your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes irregular, your muscles tense. Now here's something interesting. After crying, many people show signs of shifting back toward a calmer state. Heart rate can slow down. Breathing becomes deeper and more regular. There's often a subjective feeling of relief. Not always, but often enough that it's worth paying attention to. But this raises a question. Is crying causing the calmness, or is it just part of a larger process that leads to calmness? That distinction matters. It's possible that crying is not the solution, but one visible phase in a longer regulatory cycle. Your body ramps up, reaches a peak, and then comes down. Crying might simply happen near that peak or during the transition downward. In other words, it may be correlated with relief, without being the sole cause of it. Now let's look at the tears themselves. Emotional tears are not identical to the tears that lubricate your eyes or the tears produced when you cut an onion. They contain slightly different concentrations of certain substances, proteins, hormones, and molecules associated with stress responses. This has led to the popular idea that crying is a way of flushing out stress chemicals. It's a compelling idea, but when you examine it closely, the evidence becomes less clear. Yes, those substances are present in tears, but in very small amounts. There's no strong evidence that crying removes enough of them to significantly change your body's internal chemistry. Your liver and kidneys handle most chemical regulation far more efficiently. So if crying isn't literally detoxifying your body, then what is it doing? One possibility is that the act of crying changes your physiology indirectly. Think about what happens during a full crying episode. Your breathing becomes uneven, sometimes rapid, sometimes interrupted. Then gradually, it slows. You might take deep, irregular breaths, almost like a reset. That pattern alone can influence your nervous system, nudging it toward a calmer state. Your facial muscles also play a role. Expressions are not just outputs of emotion, they feed back into your brain. The act of crying, facial tension, vocalization, tears, may reinforce or help complete an emotional response cycle. Another layer is attention. When you cry, your focus narrows. You are no longer juggling multiple tasks or thoughts. Your system is temporarily dedicated to processing a single emotional event. That kind of focused processing might help the brain reorganize and make sense of what happened. But here's the honest part. We don't have a complete theory that ties all of this together. We have pieces, measurable changes in physiology, observable patterns in behavior, subjective reports of relief. But we don't yet have a single, unified explanation that tells us exactly why crying exists, or precisely how it affects long-term health. And that's important to admit, because it reminds us that even something as ordinary as crying sits at the edge of our understanding. We can measure the components, but the full system, the interaction between brain, body, and experience is still not completely mapped. Expanded force part 500 words, and remove all narrator headings and brackets. Now we can finally approach the central question more directly. What happens when you suppress tears? At first glance, it seems simple. You feel like crying, and you stop yourself. No tears, no visible reaction. Problem avoided. But if you look more closely, something much more complex is happening beneath the surface. Suppressing tears is not the absence of an action, it's the presence of another action. Your body is preparing to cry. Signals are being sent from emotional centers in the brain. Your breathing begins to shift, your chest tightens, your throat constricts, and then something intervenes. You deliberately or automatically override that process. You tighten your facial muscles, you control your breathing, you redirect your attention. In some cases, you even change your posture or swallow repeatedly to stop the sensation in your throat. All of this requires coordination. It requires energy. So instead a single process, crying, you now have two processes happening at the same time. One part of your system is trying to express an emotional response, while another part is actively trying to suppress it. This creates a kind of internal competition. From a neurological perspective, this involves different regions of the brain. The emotional signal often originates in areas like the amygdala and related structures that evaluate significance and trigger responses. The suppression comes from higher-level control systems, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision-making and regulation. These systems are not enemies, but they are not perfectly aligned either. When they send conflicting signals, the body reflects that conflict. You might notice increased tension, especially in the face, neck, and shoulders. Your breathing may become shallow or irregular. Your heart rate might remain elevated instead of settling. In other words, suppression doesn't eliminate the emotional response. It changes how that response is distributed through the system. Now consider what happens if this pattern repeats over time. Not once or twice, that's normal, but consistently. Each time an emotional response begins, it is interrupted. The system doesn't complete the process it initiated. Instead, it shifts into a controlled, restrained state. This can lead to a subtle accumulation of unresolved physiological activation. Not dramatic, not immediately visible, but measurable in small ways. Slightly elevated stress levels, persistent muscle tension, increased cognitive effort to maintain control. There's also a cognitive cost. Suppression requires attention. You have to monitor yourself. Don't cry. Stay composed. Keep it together. That monitoring uses mental resources. It's like running a background program on a computer. It doesn't stop other processes, but it reduces overall efficiency. And then there's the emotional aspect. When you suppress tears, you are not just stopping a physical action. You are interrupting a form of emotional expression. The feeling doesn't necessarily disappear. It may linger, change shape, or reappear later in a different context. But here's where we need to be precise. Suppression is not inherently harmful in every situation. In many cases, it is useful. Social environments often require a degree of control. You might need to function, make decisions, or communicate clearly in situations where crying would interfere. The ability to suppress is part of being adaptable. The issue arises when suppression becomes the default response rather than a flexible option. A system that always overrides its own signals begins to lose sensitivity. It becomes less responsive to internal cues, less capable of adjusting naturally. So the question is not whether suppression is bad. The more accurate question is, what is the cost of repeatedly interrupting a process your body is trying to carry out? And the answer seems to be that the cost is not a single dramatic failure, but a gradual shift in how the system operates. More effort, more tension, and less natural flow between emotional states. Expanded Fist Part 500 words and remove all narrator headings and brackets. Let's shift the perspective slightly and think about emotions not as mysterious forces, but as information. That may sound a bit cold at first, but it's actually a very useful way to understand what's going on. Imagine your mind as a kind of inbox. Not a perfect one. Messages arrive out of order, some are clear, some are confusing, some are urgent, and some are just noise. Emotions are like those messages. They carry information about your internal state and your relationship to the world around you. A small irritation might be a short message. Something is slightly off. A deep loss might be a long, complex message. Something important has changed, and it matters deeply. Now, where does crying fit into this? Crying might be one of the ways your system processes certain kinds of messages, especially the ones that are too complex, too intense, or too intertwined to handle purely through thought. It's not just expression. It may also be part of integration. When you cry, your attention narrows, your body shifts, and your system focuses on that one message more fully. Now imagine what happens when you consistently suppress tears. It's like marking those messages as unread, but not deleting them. They don't vanish, they remain in the system, still carrying their informational weight. You can continue functioning, replying to other messages, handling daily tasks, but something is accumulating in the background. At first, this accumulation is subtle. You might not notice anything unusual. The system is robust, it can handle a lot, but over time, the load increases. More and more messages remain partially processed, not ignored completely, but never fully resolved either. This doesn't mean they suddenly explode one day in a dramatic way. That's a common oversimplification. What's more likely is a gradual effect. The system becomes less efficient. Small things start to feel heavier than they should. Your reactions may become slightly disproportionate, not because of the current situation alone, but because it's interacting with a backlog of unresolved signals. There's also an interesting effect on clarity. When emotional information isn't fully processed, it can become harder to distinguish between different states. You might feel off without knowing exactly why. The signal is there, but it's mixed with others, layered and entangled. Now, to be clear, crying is not the only way to process these messages. Humans have many mechanisms: talking, reflecting, writing, even physical activity. Crying is just one pathway among several. But if one pathway is consistently blocked, the system has to rely more heavily on others. That's not necessarily a problem, but it changes how the system operates. Another important detail is that not all messages require the same kind of processing. Some emotions pass quickly. Others require repeated attention over time. Crying tends to appear when the system reaches a certain threshold, when the message is not just present, but significant enough to demand a deeper level of engagement. Suppressing tears, then, is not simply about avoiding a visible reaction. It's about interrupting one possible route of processing. The information remains, but the pathway is altered. So the question becomes more nuanced. It's not, do suppressed emotions disappear? Clearly they don't in a simple sense, but it's also not, do they always cause damage? That's too simplistic as well. A better way to think about it is this. Your mind and body are constantly managing information. When certain signals are repeatedly deferred rather than processed, the system adapts. It continues to function, but under slightly different conditions that may involve more effort, less clarity, and a greater reliance on indirect ways of resolving what was left unfinished. Expanded 6-part 500 words and remove all narrative headings and brackets. Now let's go one level deeper and look at something that is often overlooked. Crying is not just something that happens inside you, it is also something that happens between people. Humans are social organisms. This is not a philosophical statement, it's a biological one. Your brain is built from the ground up to interact with other brains. Much of what you feel, express, and even understand depends on that interaction. In that context, crying takes on a very different role. Think about what happens when someone cries in front of you. You don't just observe it like you would observe a mechanical process. Something in you responds. Your attention shifts. You may feel concern, discomfort, empathy, or even confusion. Your body might subtly mirror their state. Your facial muscles change. Your breathing adjusts. Without any formal training, you understand that something significant is happening. Crying is a signal, not a precise one, not a language with grammar, but a powerful indicator that this person is experiencing something important. It compresses a complex internal state into a visible, recognizable form. Instead of explaining everything in words, the body communicates directly. Now consider what happens when that signal is suppressed. From the outside, nothing unusual appears. The person looks composed, controlled, perhaps even unaffected. But the internal state has not necessarily changed. The signal has been removed, but the condition it was signaling may still be present. This creates a kind of disconnect, not only within the individual, but between individuals. Other people rely on signals to understand what's happening. When those signals are absent, they have to guess. Sometimes they guess correctly, often they don't. This can subtly affect relationships, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in small, cumulative mismatches. Someone might think they seem fine, when in fact they are not. Or they may sense that something is wrong, but lack the information to respond appropriately. Over time, this can lead to reduced emotional synchronization between people. There's also another layer. When you suppress tears repeatedly in social contexts, you are training others, without realizing it, to interpret you in a certain way. They learn that you don't show vulnerability in that form. As a result, they may respond differently to you compared to someone who expresses emotion more openly. This is not necessarily good or bad, but it shapes the kind of interactions you have. At the same time, social environments often encourage suppression. Many situations reward composure and discourage visible emotional expression. So you end up with a tension between two functions: the biological tendency to signal internal states and the social pressure to regulate or hide those signals. This tension is not easily resolved because both sides serve a purpose. Signaling helps coordination and empathy. Suppression helps stability and function in structured environments. So the question becomes more subtle again. When you suppress tears, you are not just affecting your internal physiology, you are modifying the information available to the people around you. You are changing the feedback loop between yourself and your social environment. And that loop matters. Your emotional system does not operate in isolation. It continuously adjusts based on how others respond to you. If signals are consistently muted, the feedback becomes weaker or less accurate. The system still works, but with less precision. What makes this difficult to study scientifically is that these effects are distributed. They don't show up as a single, measurable variable. Instead, they appear as patterns over time: slight misunderstandings, delayed responses, reduced emotional alignment. So crying, in this sense, is not just a personal release or a biological reflex. It is part of a larger communication system, one that links individual nervous systems into something more collective. And when you suppress it, you're not simply holding back tears, you're altering the flow of information in that system in ways that are subtle, complex, and still not fully understood. Expanded, 7th part 500 words, and remove all narrator headings and brackets. Now we can begin to gather everything together and ask a more careful question. If crying, suppression, physiology, and social signaling are all intertwined, what kind of system are we actually dealing with? It helps to stop thinking in terms of single causes and effects. The human organism is not a device where you press a button and get a predictable output. It's closer to what physicists would call a complex system: many interacting parts, feedback loops, and constant adjustment. In such systems, small changes don't always produce immediate, visible results. Instead, they shift probabilities. They change tendencies over time. Crying and the suppression of crying fit into this kind of system. Imagine a network of interconnected processes, brain activity, hormone levels, muscle tension, breathing patterns, attention, memory, and social interaction. None of these operate independently. Each influences the others, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. When an emotional event occurs, this network reorganizes itself in response. Crying might be one configuration of that network, a particular pattern where multiple subsystems align in a certain way. Suppressing tears, then, is not simply turning off that pattern. It's forcing the system into an alternative configuration, one where control mechanisms override expression mechanisms. The important question is not which configuration is correct, but how flexible the system remains. Flexibility is a key property of complex systems. A flexible system can shift between states depending on context. It can express, suppress, recover, and adapt. A rigid system, on the other hand, gets stuck. It relies too heavily on one mode of operation, even when conditions change. If someone never cries, regardless of the situation, that suggests a kind of rigidity. Not necessarily a visible problem, but a reduced range of responses. The system has fewer options available. On the other hand, if someone is overwhelmed by crying in every situation, that's another form of rigidity. Too little control rather than too much. So the issue is not crying versus suppression. It's whether the system can move between them appropriately. Now consider long-term patterns. If suppression becomes habitual, the system may gradually recalibrate. What once triggered a full emotional response might now be dampened earlier in the process. This can reduce immediate discomfort, but it may also reduce sensitivity to certain internal signals. The system becomes quieter, but not necessarily healthier, just less responsive. At the same time, the energy required for constant regulation doesn't disappear. It shows up in other forms: mental fatigue, subtle tension, reduced emotional clarity. These are not dramatic failures, they're small shifts in baseline functioning. There's also the issue of feedback. In a flexible system, responses lead to feedback, which informs future responses. If crying occurs and leads to relief, support, or resolution, the system learns something about how to handle similar situations. If suppression occurs instead, the feedback loop changes. The system may learn to prioritize control over expression, even when expression might have been useful. But again, this is not a moral statement. The system is not trying to be good or bad. It is trying to maintain stability under varying conditions. Suppression can be adaptive in one context and costly in another. The same behavior can have different effects depending on timing, frequency, and environment. What makes this difficult to pin down, scientifically, is that these dynamics unfold over time. You don't see a single event and conclude, this caused harm. Instead, you observe patterns. How easily someone shifts between states, how much effort regulation requires, how clearly they perceive their own internal signals. So when we ask whether suppressing tears harms you, we're really asking whether it reduces the flexibility of a complex adaptive system, and the answer seems to be that it can, gradually, subtly, and in ways that are not always immediately visible, but become meaningful over longer periods of time.